What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to the Lovers World mini-series. So today we're gonna get really candid. I'm gonna be talking about fatherhood. Fatherhood, and which is really important for me because like being a young father, I became a father when I was 18 years old, 17 going on 18 years old. So fatherhood was definitely something that really impacted my life and made me see things differently, so we're gonna definitely get into that today. I think fatherhood definitely changed the way I saw the world because I remember whispering in my son's ear when he was born and telling him that I would never leave his side. I remember that day, you know, to a T, and I just knew from that moment that I could no longer fuck around. My son meant everything to me. I needed to be better in life. I needed to give life my 100%. I couldn't just be existing in life anymore. I have a son that I have to lead by an example. I have to show him what a king is, and I have to raise him to be an amazing man, and that's something that's super important for me. Becoming a father really made me see things very differently. When my son, he was 2 years old, his mom had abandoned him. And at that age, at that time of being a father, I knew nothing about being a full-time parent. I knew nothing about being a full-time father, I just remember telling my mom, I don't know how I'm gonna do this, Mom. I don't know how I'm gonna do this. Mom, she left. She left. I can't get a hold of her. I just remember really, it's not funny. Don't you laugh, cause it's not funny. But that's where I was at, I really felt really, I felt out of place. I didn't know how I was gonna raise my son, without his mom, and I know that she was banking on me to, fall apart and me to just throw in the towel too, but I couldn't. And I remember my mom saying to me yo, son, it's not gonna be easy, but you're gonna get through this. And at that time, I didn't know how I was gonna do it. And what got me through those times was just my family support. I moved in with my mom and, that's what it was, it hurt me to move back in with my mom because at the time I felt like I was moving backwards. But I understood why I needed to move back with my mom because I really needed that support from my son. I needed my son to be around family at that time. I didn't want my son to feel the absency of his mother. I didn't want that to be a big thing, for him. I wanted him to feel love. I wanted him to feel the energy of being in a family that accepts him, that wants him around, And that was one of the main things. What does my son teach me without me even realizing it? My son teaches me patience. He teaches me that, I have to be patient in life. There was a time when my son was going to school where I expected my son to be perfect, a perfect angel. But I really had to really think to myself yo, my son has been through a lot of shit. My son is not going to be a perfect angel every time, And that's part of understanding, I had to stop with, always result into, grabbing the belt and just, I had to really pull back from that, because it's as much as growing up, growing up, I got my ass whooped, but it was just like, does that really, really help? Like, can you really change a child like that? And I know a lot of black families, they're like, oh yeah, the belt always worked, but but like, I really had to really say to myself, like, yo, especially when he would do the same things over and over, I had to really think of another way to get through to my son. And basically how I got through to my son is by talking to my son. Having some type of understanding, okay, what about your day sucked? What about your day made you feel like how you feel? Like what's really going on? Like a lot of times, it had a lot to do with his mom not being there for him. And I relate to my son and how he felt, because how he felt is exactly how I felt about my father. It's just like, you purposely misbehave in school, you purposely fail your tests, you purposely act out because, you're craving your parents' attention, you're craving your mom, you're craving your dad to be a parent, and I really had to understand that, and a lot of that has definitely taught me patience with my son, patient with just like being a parent, like it's tough. It's tough being a parent sometimes, but I think what gets me through every time is just knowing how much we've been through, knowing that, okay, we've been through a lot of shit to get here, When I first became a parent, like, I felt like everything was hard. But now everything is easy for me. Do I ever, like, make any songs about my son? Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course I've made songs about my son. One of the songs that I did write about my son is called I'm the Man in My Space. And the reason why that song really resonated with my son and me is because I remember when, around the time that my son did, get abandoned by his mom, it was just me and him. Me and him in our room. We shared a room, and basically, I remember we had this pool table, little tiny pool table, little balls, paws, and basically we would get down on the wooden floor, and I believe those videos are still on YouTube, but those moments right there meant a lot to me because my son was so small, so innocent, and like we really would have a time just like playing pool, playing pool with my boy, like we would really just like, it really, and just different things like we would do. One of the things that I felt comforting in that time was he was so much about YouTube. So like we had our own channel, and like we would, do like little videos, us playing pool, us going to get a nice pumpkin for Halloween, just different things we would do. And I found that was some of the greatest times for me as a father. I got to really bond with my son and just really just be a staple with my son, and a time that was so dark for him, it didn't seem so dark, and we had to really lean on each other for just getting over things and just being strong, and I think that's why me and my son are so close now. And, there is nothing that I wouldn't do for my son, and I would never let anything ever happen to my son. One day I said to myself, I'm like, listen, I felt like the music wasn't really going anywhere. And I said to myself, it was at that moment that I said, damn, like, I don't want my son to think that I'm a quitter. I don't want my son to get the idea that, oh, it's okay to quit on your dreams. you know, because you never know when you're going to make it. You never know when you're going to just, you know, take off, you know, and I think that that's super important for me because that was an eye opener that you can really accomplish anything, you know, if you have that dream in your mind and you apply that hard work, you know. I wanted my son to see that daddy worked hard. Daddy never gave up on himself. He never gave up on his dream. And he most certainly will never ever give up on you, you know. And I think that that was super important for me. And showing my son, like, yo, you know, even down to bringing him to the studio, you know, when we were going through certain things, you know, just bringing my son to the studio, him seeing me work in the studio, him seeing that atmosphere, I think it really, really, it made him see like, yo, daddy is really out here grinding. I remember being at my mom's and just saying to myself, like, yo, I need a space for my son. Like, I need, like, my son to have his own room and stuff like that, you know. And it was a long time of sharing a room with my son. You know, we needed space. You know, I needed space for my son to grow. And you know, it was years of staying with my mom, and you know, I was really in that funk. You know, but you know, one day we got that call from housing. I'm not ashamed to say that I lived in housing, because housing is what gave me and my son's first apartment. And it gave us the legs to be able to be free and you know, just have our own place, you know. And so I lived in housing for a few years, and that was just like a great way for me to just grow with my son. You know, it was just him and I, and we just like really was able to like be on our own. You know, he had his own room. I had my own room. You know, we had our living room. You know, it was really good. But now to be closing on my townhome where my son has his new room, spacious room, lots of space. I have a spacious room, my own bathroom, and he has his own bathroom, you know, different things like that, you know, like to be in a space of where there's a nice trail, there's a gym, there's a pool on our property. We really, really came from nothing. And going from living with my mom to where we are right now is definitely something that I'm really humble about, because, you know, I know it's been a long journey. My son, he's excited to move, and I'm excited that I could do that for him, you know. I'm excited that I can do that for him. I just remember, like, recently my child's mom, she basically was trying to take my son away from me and, you know, take him for middle school and have him live in Troy. I don't have nothing against Troy. However, I feel like there's a lot of violence currently going on in Troy, you know, and I feel like I want better for my son, you know, which was part of the reason why, we decided to move as well, because I feel like I want more for my son than just being in Troy, going to Troy schools, and, you know, I want more for my son. And I don't think that I'm wrong for wanting more for my son. But like, I'm not gonna lie. That really triggered me. It really triggered me to hear those words come out her mouth, because I've been the one that's been raising our son since he was born. But I've been the one raising our son for over 10 years. And here you think that you could just come in when you're good and ready and think that you could take my son away from me. I thought that was crazy. You know, I thought, like, damn, something is really going on in her brain to really think that she could just come in and take my son away from me. And so, like, I'm just like at a point where it's just like, it was very triggering for me to hear those words because I could never imagine not having my son. And to hear those words come out her mouth after all the years that I put in to raise our son, it was very triggering for me. And I want to say, like, it hurt my soul. It definitely made me think, like, damn, like, yo, like, is she okay? Like, and basically, just a lot of different things that I won't discuss on here, but just know that that could never happen, you know? And I'm just grateful that I do have custody of my son, you know, because I'm grateful that I have custody of my son because she can't just take my son away from me, you know, because I put in this time, I earned this title of being his father. And like, you know, I've told my son countless times, you know, you can go see your mother whenever you want to go see her, you know, but my son understands that, you know, he lives with me. And he understands that, you know, I want what's best for him, you know. I don't want him being in Troy, roaming the streets, you know, like, you feel me? Get caught in the crossfire, you know, like, they let their kids do just about anything, you know? And that's not what I want for my son, you know? Got kids that's 2 and 3 years old just out in the streets. That's not what I want for my son. I don't want my son to, you know, be living life like that. I don't want to have to live a life where I have to worry about my son, worry about his well-being. I don't want to live like that. But I think what got me through that was just simply reminding myself, like, yo, like, she trying to fuck with me. Like, she really trying to fuck with me because she know that she can get a reaction out of me when it comes down to my son.